I'm Matt Hammond. The Australian Council of Trade Unions recently visited climate scientists at the CSIRO Marine and Atmospheric Research Centre in Melbourne. Together with the CSIRO Staff Association, we spoke with some of Australia's leading researchers in climate science. We asked them to respond to the 5 most common questions about climate change that we deal with each day. Okay, the first and most glaring question, is there in fact a consensus from scientists that climate change is real?
There's not a consensus about anything from anybody in general. You were talking about 95%, so let's go for the 95%. We'll agree with that. But then there are some very prominent sceptics as well, some for whom you would give far more time to than others. And we have a lot of people who believe if they can just find one little piece of the greenhouse gas emission puzzle that isn't quite right, then that means the whole edifice is totally wrong and it's discredited. Now that's not quite the way I believe science works, which is that yes, people are human, they make slight mistakes, sometimes the data can be argued about, sometimes the observations, the models can be argued about, but that doesn't mean that the whole theory is wrong. So the scientists know that. I fear that in many cases the public doesn't.
Human-produced CO2 emissions make up less than 1% of the total amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. How is cutting such a tiny amount of carbon dioxide going to make any difference to the environment?
I'd like to take on that one. I think to start with, the premise is wrong. So 1% is completely wrong. We know that CO2 has increased in concentration about 40% over the last few hundred years. We're confident we know that is fossil fuels and land clearing, so anthropogenic sources. We don't see a rate of change of the CO2 as fast as we've seen now for the past 20,000 years or more. So again, the present situation is well above anything in the natural long-term past. So further evidence, fingerprinting of the type of CO2 that we're seeing in the atmosphere, and by looking at the isotopic ratio of the carbon in the CO2 that's increased in the atmosphere, we see that the carbon-13, the carbon-14 are all consistent with fossil fuel as the main source. So I think the overall picture from all of those sources is, we are extremely certain that the last 200 years increases in CO2 and a number of other gases is largely due to fossil fuels.
Changing topics, clean energy is great, but it's not much good if the sun isn't shining or if the wind isn't blowing. How is clean energy going to make sure we have enough baseload power?
I mean, it's almost a non-question because there's a very simple answer to it, which is to diversify. And you can diversify geographically, which is that you make use of the fact that when it's windy in not windy in one spot, it'll probably be windy somewhere else. You can diversify by mode, and there's lots of different types of renewables. Solar thermal, solar photovoltaics, wind turbines, geothermal, biomass, indirect wind, which is wave energy, tidal energy, OTEC, which ocean thermal energy conversion. So there's oodles of different ways, and if you have a lot of these going, then similarly you're diversifying because, okay, when it's dark, the photovoltaics aren't working, but the wind probably will be, or maybe, and the oceans will still have waves and so on. So there's lots of possible solutions for this down in the future. It all relates down to a question of what society do we want.
So with diversified sources, there would be enough for baseload power as we know it today?
I went to a wonderful talk given not that long ago at which we had the Blakers, the leader in Australian solar research. We had Adrian Williams from Geodynamics about geothermal, and we had a lady whose name I've forgotten for the wind industry, and each one of those convinced me anyway that on its own their method would produce enough power for all of Australia's needs. So if we had all three going, wow, we'd have 3 times the power we need.
Well, Denmark has developed a lot of wind power. I came from there originally when I was a kid, so I've taken a little bit of interest in it. I think they still produce about, I think they export now. They've got a big industry from wind power. I think it's something like a third of the world's wind turbines are produced there. They started this more than 30 years ago, but they also set a very high price for electricity from fossil fuel. So they've actually intervened in the market and forced the change so that the wind power actually became economical because they would tax it. So, the problem is that if you don't intervene in the market, then fossil fuels will always beat most other things because of this, this high ratio of output energy.
Well, the point Fred's making is that Australia has so much coal and it's so cheap. The obvious country to compare it to would be Japan.
Yeah.
And Japan went for nuclear, which sounded fine until we suddenly had the Fukushima problems.
Okay, the next question is, CO2 is plant food, helping plants grow faster. How can plant food be a bad thing?
Well, like with human being, if we have something too much, we quickly acclimatize to it. So if we have a headache and take aspirin every day, it will not work after a while. The same with plants. If there is carbon, elevated carbon, after a while the initial impact of increasing photosynthesis is just diminished. So it doesn't have any effect.
All right, the last question. CO2 is not the only driver of climate. Volcanoes, clouds and methane have a great impact on our climate than CO2. Is this true or not?
I think it's correct, and I don't think scientists argue otherwise. But I don't think it's greater. I think the point is there is an impact of these things, and they're reasonably well understood. But they're not. They are smaller. I think in all cases, volcanoes, clouds, and methane. The changes in those, I think, are smaller than what we call the radiative forcing that's due to the greenhouse gases. We heard, there's a lot of noise out there in the skeptics' areas that volcanic emissions are enormous compared to humans. We know that's not the case. It's about 1% compared to the human emissions. Volcanoes can have a very large impact, but only over a very short period. So the emissions are particulates largely, and they settle out. So the impact in the atmosphere is very short-lived, but it is large for a year or two.
Could I play devil's advocate for a moment? Wouldn't it be a logical conclusion that the Earth will just adapt? I mean, we will get to a point where systems will change to be able to adapt to the current environment.
Yeah, that's an issue which is beyond the carbon cycle, but can we adapt to that extra CO2, extra warming? I suspect we have to. I think there'll be a certain amount which we are locked into, no matter what trajectory we take with emissions. People are talking about probably 2 degrees being locked in. And that has significant impacts, and the adaptation will probably be costly. But to go that extra bit, unconstrained emissions will go well beyond 2 degrees, 4, 6 degrees, depending on the scenario. And those impacts are probably beyond adaptation.
So the Earth might adapt, but humans may not be compatible with that.
Well, the last time we had 4 degrees was about 5 million years ago, and you'd have to go north of Paris to live.
Right.
So you better get dual nationality then quickly.
So thank you. It sounds to me like you've all got a bloody good handle on this problem. On all aspects of it, it's outstanding. Thank you.